Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to take your seats again, we're going to get started for the afternoon discussions. So welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had a very nice lunch, and we've covered an awful lot of ground over the last day and a half. Yesterday, looking at an awful lot of subjects regarding to the fuel and the propulsion systems, and this morning, talking about technologies and what they might be in the future, looking at efficiency and how to gather data and what to do with that data. We also had a look at the fouling prevention and other areas of digitization. And so in this afternoon's session, we are moving on to, first of all, looking at compliance and legislation. So we're going to start off with a presentation on how Swiss R&D and international cooperation contribute to sustainable maritime transport solutions. Then we're going to move on to a presentation by Chris Hughes from Lloyd's Register, looking at the impact of EU regulations on shipping companies. And then we're going to have a very interesting panel discussion where we're looking at regulatory changes ahead. And this is certainly something that's going to have an impact on all of us in the marketplace. Then we're going to have a coffee break, and then we have some very, very interesting discussions before the end of the day. So on that note, it's a huge pleasure to invite to the stage Mr. Benoît Revaz, who is the director of the Office Fédéral de l'Énergie. Please join me in welcoming Benoît to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to address this conference on maritime transport efficiency. As mentioned, I will focus today on the contribution of the Swiss R&D to sustainable maritime transport and the importance of international cooperation. First of all, with the Paris Agreement, Switzerland pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. At least 30% of these reductions are to be accomplished with domestic measures. Beyond 2030, Switzerland has announced that it plans to reduce its emissions to net zero by 2050. International shipping is the backbone of the world economy, and as the world economy keeps growing, global freight transport keeps increasing too. Switzerland is a landlocked country with a strong economy, and our international trade relations span the globe. Thus, we rely heavily on international merchant shipping for the import and export of goods. For Switzerland, the River Rhine is the main artery for freight transportation on water. In 2019, the Swiss Rhine ports processed around 9% of Swiss imports and exports. Furthermore, many goods that enter or leave Switzerland via road or rail also travel some part of their global journeys on water. Given the importance of the international shipping trade, it is vital that we stand by our commitment to decarbonize all economic activities, and we recognize the importance of decarbonizing maritime shipping. In 2019, the international shipping was responsible for about 2% of the global energy-related CO2 emissions. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, anticipates in the stated policy scenario that greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping sector would further increase to 1,100 million tons CO2 equivalent in 2050. Nevertheless, the International Maritime Organization, the IMO organization, has defined ambitious targets for greenhouse gas reductions in the maritime sector, minus 40% by 2030 and minus 70% by 2050. as well as reducing other greenhouse gas emissions by 50% until 2050. With the planned climate law and the Green Deal, the EU also foresees new regulations, for example, to include maritime transport in the ETS. In its recently released Net Zero by 2050 roadmap, the IEA shows possible decarbonization pathway for the global transport sector. And the IEA expects the shipping sector to approach zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This expectation covers all greenhouse gases. And the transition towards a net zero shipping industry relies on two pillars: efficiency measures to shrink the overall fuel consumption, and fuel substitution to shift away from fossil fuels towards fuels with similarly high energy density, but much lower well-to-tank greenhouse gas emissions. In their 2020 Energy Technology Progress Report, the IEA anticipates that biofuels and energy efficiency will be the main contributors to international shipping emission reductions in the short term, while hydrogen and ammonia will contribute more in the long term. However, the IEA's analysis of the technologies known today reveals that more than half of the technologies that could contribute towards the decarbonization of shipping are still in the prototype or demonstration stage. Considering that the typical lifetime of vessel is more than 20 years, the need to accelerate innovation with further investment in research and development is undeniable. Switzerland has a strong track record of delivering innovations to the shipping industry. The old engines you can see on these pictures, from these first diesel engines in the 1890s to much larger, more efficient marine engines of today. The close collaboration between academia and industry has been a key to success. A well-established R&D network provides access to world-class expertise with the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology Zurich, the Paul Scherrer Institute, the EMPA, and the University of Applied Science, Northwestern Switzerland. Insights from academic research flow directly into private sectors, enterprises ranging from small spin-offs to international cooperation. The Swiss Federal Office of Energy has a long tradition of supporting research for efficient and clean combustion in the marine sector. With the research program on combustion-based energy system, we focus on energy efficiency, on reduction of greenhouse gases and other pollutant emissions in a fuel life cycle perspective, and on fuel flexibility. The Swiss Federal Office of Energy takes a long-term view on innovation and invests in capacity building, as illustrated by the project Hercules for high-efficiency engine R&D on combustion with ultra-low emission for ships. As early as in 2006, we funded the development of a unique large spray combustion chamber. The experimental setup was co-developed by ETHZ and Wärtsilä Switzerland, today Winterthur Diesel Limited. The current Hercules II project is collaborative efforts from 35 participating organizations from 11 European countries. And important follow-up projects connected with Hercules dealt with fuel flexibility combustion, smart use of water to reduce engine emissions, carbon-reduced dual-fuel combustion. In line with our long-term view, on capacity building, we contributed funds to the development of a novel rapid compression and expansion machine with full optical access. And this project was developed in a collaboration between ETHZ, PSI, University of Applied Science, Northwestern Switzerland, on the basis of a Libre engine. And a series of projects has already benefited from the enormous flexibility of the setup. The first project tackled generic dual fuel question, and the second project explored a variety of liquid alternative fuels. Swiss researchers actively participate in international networks to exchange information and accelerate the deployment of new technologies. The Technology Collaboration Program, the TCP of the IEA, is a highly productive network of world-class experts. The IEA and its member countries often rely on TCP expertise for policy guidance. There are in total over 40 active programs working on different renewable energy technologies, and Switzerland is currently participating in 23 programs by bringing the Swiss perspectives as well as gaining further knowledge from international collaboration. The three relevant programs with respect to marine application, where Switzerland is also participating, are advanced fuels, bioenergy, and clean and efficient combustion. IEA BioEnergy Task 39 offers a wealth of science-based reports on different biofuels used for different transportation modes. An important report on the use of biofuel within the marine sector has been published already in 2017. The report shows that the cost of biofuel is still higher than fossil fuels and expected to stay so in the short to medium term. Alternatively, low-carbon transport may be introduced as a business model, putting value on lower CO2 emissions, but not solving the problem of the price of CO2. Therefore, potential drivers for biofuel market in the shipping sector are the new sectorial IMO regulations, the targets from governments and customers, or the hedging of fuel cost in local currency, to quote some example. The authors clearly state that these factors create a potentially large market for biofuels in the shipping sector. From a biofuel producer point of view, the wide technical specifications are attractive, as well as they can lower production costs. However, both technical and logistic issues need to be resolved before biofuels can be introduced at a larger scale in the shipping sector, and a closer collaboration between biofuel producers, engine developers, and the industry is recommended as a path forward. To mention another project, the Advanced Motor Fuels Task 60 was established to create an assessment of fuel option for marine transportation, striving towards a better understanding of the potential and limitations of new marine fuel options, with a guiding question: how can the new forms of advanced marine fuels contribute to carbon neutral shipping in the future? A wide fuel spectrum will be covered, which is also mirrored by the interest and expertise of the participating country, from Canada to Denmark, Finland, Korea, Sweden, USA, and Switzerland. Furthermore, past experiences with biofuels for marine use will be included, as well as legislative issues, for example, the new IMO 2020 fuel specifications. The Swiss contribution will include an assessment of the state-of-the-art of dual fuel technology for large two-stroke engines, and the investigation of ignition and combustion properties of mixture of methane and other gases. The report will be published in about a year from now. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, and beyond the ambitious climate policy targets of Switzerland, we do recognize the enormous challenge in the decarbonization of transport. We want to build on the strong track record of Swiss academia with the industry, and will continue to promote research programs on energy efficiency, on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions over the entire life cycle, and on fuel flexibility. However, the key success factor will be further support to national and international cooperation, and to develop the best solutions and bring, at the end of the day, this solution to the markets as quickly as possible. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think it was very, very interesting, and it's good to hear all the different initiatives that you're involved with. On that note, can I ask if there are any questions from the audience? Anyone's curious to know how this all works and how it's been gone about? So any questions at all? I'd just be interested to ask you, I mean, how does, in terms of talking with the industry here in Switzerland, how does the collaboration go? Is it a very close collaboration? Is it, are you talking to them on a daily basis? Are there a lot of actors in Switzerland with whom you're involved in the private sector?
Actually, the collaboration with the private sector and the link to the Swiss Confederation is coming over research programs, pilot and demonstration programs, mainly in a collaboration between private players and academia, ETHZ, PSI, EMPA. This is the main link we do have with the industry.
Okay, and just a bit of a follow-up question for that. In terms of the collaboration with other countries, how they are going about the similar approaches, is it something you cooperate very closely, or is it mainly through organizations like the IMO, or do you have bilateral cooperation as well?
The different programs of the International Energy Agency constitute the platform for the exchange on the research and the best practice that can be shared internationally. All the data is available on the website of the IEA, and of course the IEA is very interested in bringing not only the countries, the member countries together, but also the different industries that are concerned by the decarbonization challenges.
Excellent. Benoît, sorry, I kept you on stage too long, and then we ended up with a question on the board. So we have a question from the audience, from Wolfgang. Biofuels are said to be unsustainable when introduced at large scale. Why is Switzerland not promoting e-fuels from renewable energy instead?
This is an excellent question, and we are dealing with this challenge because effectively the biofuels on the full value chain have a potential negative elements. The big challenge we do face with e-fuels is to consider it both on a national perspective and international perspective. Because the most efficient way to use electricity is a direct use. As you transform it, you have losses. And as we face big challenges on the Swiss supply and the security of supply, especially in the winter time, it will be difficult to develop e-fuels that are heavy on electricity use in Switzerland. So we are discussing with different countries now in order to see what can be the main trends to have an international e-fuel generation and production chain that can be used also for the supply of Swiss players.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your clear answer. It seems that now we've got the questions started. So just a couple of quick questions before we do hand over to Chris. Second question is, how about the decarbonisation through batteries and hydrogen? How is OFEN contributing to that, since Swiss technology has clearly the power to be a game changer?
Actually, hydrogen will be a game changer in Europe. The big question will again be the supply chain of hydrogen to have green hydrogen in order to decarbonize the full value chain. We are actually preparing a roadmap on hydrogen in order to address all questions linked to hydrogen, from the supply chain to the transportation, storage question. There are a lot of regulatory challenges in order to have a view, and as Switzerland is not an island, we have also to consider the international perspective and look after what the different countries in Europe are actually developing. Batteries, you know the challenges on the price of batteries, and especially for the shipping, probably for short distances up to 200 kilometers, more will be probably difficult. And
we had an interesting discussion on that yesterday about the battery-powered ships. Just moving on to the last question, because this ties in very well with our next presentation, which is going to be given by Chris. There's a high ambition in Switzerland on climate, but no clear legislation. Do we expect changes in the energy laws as in Europe?
Yeah, the main difficulty is that all the legislation on energy has developed with different sources, and we have a kind of silos for electricity, gas, and for the different infrastructure. And on the top of that, we are coming now with the decarbonization target, mainly the climate targets and the CO2 regulation. Now we have the ambitions based on the Paris Agreement. We are developing the regulatory basis for that. As most of you know, the Swiss citizen did not accept the CO2 law in June this year. We are preparing a new law project for the Parliament with the ambition to bring that to the Parliament beginning of next year.
We have a couple more questions, but unfortunately, otherwise we're going to be in trouble for time.
I can answer quickly. No preferred alternative. I think we will have to need all possibilities. There is not one size fits all solution with the different alternatives. It will depend on the industry, also regional consequences of the development of one alternative or the other.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's very interesting. Please join me in thanking Benoît for the presentation. Thank you. So now we're going to move on to a presentation from Chris Hughes from Lloyd's Register, looking at the impact of EU regulations on shipping companies. So please welcome Chris to the stage.
Thanks, Richard. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I've got a double header about regulations now, so I'm going to try and, it can be a pretty dry subject. I'm going to try and kind of keep it interesting in two main ways. So we're going to have a panel session where I've got 4 really interesting people that are going to come up on the panel and talk about the future of regulations, what's coming, what needs to be coming, what the future is going to look like. And now I'm going to talk about some of the regulations that are here now and in the process of being implemented, but I'm not going to bore you with the details of the regulations. I'm going to assume a lot of you know those already. If you don't, come and find me afterwards. I'm happy to talk about it for hours. So what I'm going to talk about mainly here is the impacts on us, the markets and the industry of the current regulations coming through the IMO and through the EU. So the title was about the EU. I'm going to expand on that a little bit and talk about the IMO as well. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to peel back the onion of the different kind of short-term regulations that we have at the moment. What are the common themes in the current regulations? You can see there's quite a few of them. They're primarily focused around driving efficiency, carbon intensity out of vessels. So this is an efficiency conference. The good news is most of the current regulations are focused on improving the efficiency, both technical and operational efficiency of the current fleet and future vessels. Now, an interesting thing is the IMO has been widely criticised that the regulations that we're looking at here, the IMO ones, are not going far enough. They're too weak. They're not really going to decarbonise shipping. Now, that might be true, that may not be true, but what's important, just because they're not going far enough in terms of reducing carbon emissions potentially, doesn't mean they're not going to have an impact on markets, on individual ships and individual stakeholders in shipping today. So let's dive into some of the IMO regulations first. So it's an alphabet soup. We've got DCS regulations are here already. This is regulations aimed at gathering the data so that we can implement the other regulations. So IMO has the information to inform future decisions as well. That's already in place. We have the EEXI. EEDI has been around since 2015. We're up to phase 3 now, which is driving the efficiency of new build vessels. We've got the CII regulations, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, coming in 2023. And then in the future, we've got potential price on carbon, EEDI phase 4, and fuel sustainability requirements. Again, what's common about all the current IMO regulations? They're all focused around efficiency of vessels. The positive is they are all strengthening the business case for efficiency technologies. And when I talk about efficiency technologies, I'm talking about hardware, be it sails, other hydrogen technologies, engine technologies, and software. Some of the technologies that we saw this morning aimed at improving the operational efficiencies of vessel. These regulations do recognise improvements and changes in fuel as well. And one very interesting thing I think about the current IMO short-term regulations is they are quite generous and positive around how they treat LNG as a fuel. And on the flip side, you get absolutely no benefit from the IMO for using biofuels at the moment. So let's have a look into the first one, EEXI. So again, EEXI there's been several studies done into the impact of the EEXI regulation. What EEXI is aiming to do is to improve the technical efficiency, the design efficiency of the existing fleet. And again, several of these kind of studies have shown that, or estimated that the EEXI is going to have a pretty limited impact on carbon emissions from shipping and the fleet. However, what we've been doing is some work where we delve into this a bit deeper, and this is not always the case. What I've got here is a graph on the screen that's showing potential impact, the requirement in the handy bulker sector of the impact of EEXI and how it's going to drive potential speed reductions. So what we can see from, this is based on real data, this is not estimated simulated data, this is based on real noon reports and sensor data from vessels out there operating today. And 75% of the fleet of handies today are going to have to reduce speed by at least 0.2 knots and 55% above 0.4 knots. Now that doesn't sound like much, but that's a reduction of average speed. So what that equates to over the whole fleet is a potential 4.5% reduction in capacity with the handy sector. So if we're looking at, freight rates are, a function of balance of supply and demand, this regulation is potentially going to reduce the supply of tonnage in this particular sector by about 4.5%. This is based on analysis that we did in the early part of this year, based on the last 18 months. This doesn't include the last few months where a lot of the sector has sped up further, and therefore the impacts are going to be even higher. Another really important thing with this and the other IMO impacts is the impact on each vessel is differentiated. Some vessels, this makes no difference to. They're not going to have to slow down. They can still speed up, the more efficient vessels. The less efficient vessels are going to have to slow down by more and harder. So this is leading to a decommoditization of vessels in the market, potential multi-tier markets. So, as one of my colleagues says, EXI is just the ticket to the game, but the main game is CIIs. So the CII regulations entering into force from 2023 are very interesting because it's a progressive regulation. Every year it gets a bit harder to comply with. So what this means is this regulation is basically going to put a use-by date on every internationally trading vessel. Every vessel will hit a date when they just can't slow down anymore. It's not economically viable to trade the vessel in the market or to invest further in technologies. So this is really important in that it's going to drive scrapping. Again, it's differentiated impacts. Some vessels are going to be forced out of the market earlier than more efficient vessels. It's very interesting, again, from the business case for the efficiency technologies that we've been talking about, because this drives the business case away from just being return on investment in terms of fuel savings. The potential return on investment of investing in efficiency technologies is an increase in usable life. If you invest in this technology, it could increase the commercial life of the vessel by a year or two. What's really interesting, again, this is looking at the bulk carrier fleet here. We've done some analysis for the other sectors as well, and I'm happy to share that later. But let's look at how much difference CIIs are going to make. So by 2026, based on the way the current bulk carrier fleet is operating 3 months ago, like I said, let alone at the moment where they've sped up even more, by 2026, 60% of the fleet is going to be D or E rated. And sorry, just to take a step back for you guys that are not aware, the way this regulation works is it rates every vessel in the fleet A, B, C, D, E. What the IMO are going to do is there's going to be some type of consequences in terms of restrictions on trade, additional costs if you're D or E rated vessels. So based on the current fleet, 2026, 60% of that fleet is going to be D rated and 30% are going to be E. If we look forward to 2030, 90% of the current bulk carrier fleet is going to be D-rated or worse, and 70% E-rated. And this is based on, the IMO hasn't actually decided exactly where they're going to set the regulations for 2026 to 2030 at the moment. This is based on the minimum, essentially, of what there is a possibility that 26 to 30 could be even more impactful than what we've got here. So this is a significant impact. This is really going to drive changes in the market. It's going to increase the operational complexity of vessels because this is a measure of operational efficiency. It comes down to the design of the vessel, again, the technical efficiency, but also how that vessel is operated. So charterers and owners are going to have an increased level of interaction complexity. This is another dimension that needs to be managed within shipping operations. So that's the IMO regulations we've got at the moment. Let's start looking at the EU regulations. So what we're seeing here is, again, there has been some criticism of the IMO for not moving fast enough in the area of regulations, and that has arguably given the EU a mandate to step in and increase their regulations. What is important about the proposed EU regulations we're going to talk about here is typically they have the potential for bigger impact on ships and markets and sooner than the IMO regulation. So the EU is putting a price on carbon from 2023 within shipping. That's not happening in the IMO yet. They are stimulating demand for lower carbon fuels starting from 2025. That's not happening elsewhere yet. They're introducing well-to-wake. So whereas the IMO, we're still looking at tank-to-wake emissions, EU from 2025 are proposing to bring in well-to-wake carbon intensity. They're bringing in regulations about access to capital, Energy Taxation Directive. I'm not going to talk about those now here in the interest of time, and also because Olivier is going to talk about that later this afternoon, and he's a much better place than myself to talk about that. But let's put these EU regulations, particularly the inclusion of shipping in the European EU emission trading scheme, and also the Fuel EU maritime regulations. This is projected costs, average costs per vessel of the combined two regulations looking forward here. So if we look at 2025, on average, and this is based on MRV data from last year, so this is based on the emissions that were reported to the EU already last year, adding in the proposed regulations. So an average of about 370,000 euros per annum cost per ship in 2025, increasing to around about $700,000 per ship per year in 2023. This is some analysis you can probably see in the fine print there that we ran earlier this year based on an EU ETS price of 50 euros per tonne of carbon. That's around about 60 now, so already half of this is 20% more expensive than our estimates here. Obviously, you can see from this is going to have an impact on markets, on freight rates in and out of Europe, we believe. Now, I think a lot of people are pretty well aware of the EU ETS and shipping's inclusion. But another one that I find that a lot of people are not so aware of is another proposal called the Fuel EU Maritime Regulations. And what this regulation is doing is putting a cap on the carbon intensity of the fuel. So it's not about how much carbon you emit, it's about the fuels that you are using within vessels, on voyages within the EU or in and out of EU ports. How does it work? Basically, what they're doing is, like I said, they're putting a cap on the grams of carbon per megajoule of the fuel you use, and that cap is reducing year on year it's proposed to kick in 2025 down to 2050. So what we've done here is drawn on here the carbon intensity of some common fuels, there's several fuel options at the moment. This kind of group of lines here is kind of VLSFO, MGO, those kind of fuel oil-based fuels today. So what you can see is when this regulation comes in 2025, the regulation will limit the intensity of the fuels you burn to 2% below, essentially, MGO. And the way the regulation works is, if you're compliant, great. You get a certificate, you're allowed to trade. If you're above the limit, you pay a penalty on that gap. So as you can see, as we go further ahead here, that penalty, if you're burning conventional fuel oils, increases year on year. And this is the incentive to drive demand for low and zero carbon fuels. Let you know where some of the lines are. Here, also here is LNG if it's burned in an Otto cycle engine. This here, and don't forget these are well to wake. This here is the line for LNG if burned in a diesel cycle engine due to the difference in methane slip. So you can see here, basically you're compliant for LNG up to and around about 2035 if using a diesel cycle engine. Up here, we have natural gas-derived ammonia and methanol. So you would be paying a significant penalty today for using those fuels within the EU. Down here is synthetic e-hydrogen, e-ammonia as well, and you would be compliant, of course, well up to 2050 by using these fuels. Biofuels depend on the origin of the fuel, and similarly methanol, but they tend to be kind of around about here somewhere within this range. So what does this look like? Well, two interesting things. One is the quantum of the penalties for these regulations. So the penalty basically has been proposed at 2,400 euros per equivalent tonne of VLSFO. So every non-compliant tonne of VLSFO you burn, or equivalent if you're burning another fuel, you've got to pay a penalty of 2,400 euros. So If we kind of go back here, say you're burning VLSFO, 2025, you're going to pay 2,400 euros on 2% of the fuel you burn. 6% 2030, 13% in 2035. The other really interesting thing with this regulation is you are allowed to pool vessels. So if you have 10 ships, one of them running on net zero hydrogen, say, and a bunch of other vessels that are running on VLSFO, as long as the average across that pool of vessels is compliant, you don't have to, you comply, you don't have to pay the penalties. Okay. That pool of vessels can be, as it's proposed at the moment, is arbitrary. They don't have to be all the same owner. They could be organised by a charterer. They could be organised by a group of owners that come together. So this is really interesting, because what this does is this provides value to going beyond compliance. Okay, you can essentially trade that gap between where you are and how much better you are than the regulation. So if we try and put that into some figures, here, if we look in 2025, if I had a ship running on zero carbon, net zero fuels, well, close to net zero fuels, if I had one ship, it's cut off here, I could offset 21 other ships running on VLSFO. So that one ship on the zero carbon fuel would offset my other 21 vessels, and I'd be compliant, assuming they're the same size, same consumptions. If I've got LNG, basically one LNG vessel, again using a diesel cycle engine, is going to offset almost 3 conventional fuel oil vessels in 2025. Here we've got B50, so this is like a 50% biofuel blend. Again, it depends on the source, but we're around about 4 vessels there. If you're 100% biofuel, sustainable EU R&D compliant biofuels, you could offset almost 9 vessels. If we put that in, I was going to say dollars, in euro terms, in 2025, if I'm burning VLSFO, I'm going to be paying some penalty here, and that penalty is going to increase year on year. But again, if I had a LNG fueled vessel in 2025, that is around about 311 euros worth of value, basically, that I could pool, trade with other owners or other vessels in my fleet to offset their costs. Now that's significant, because today, you know, IFO and Rotterdam, fuel oil is trading at about 390 euros per tonne. So what we're seeing here is some potential value, real ways to kind of trade or to offset the additional cost and investment that people are making in alternative fuels vessels. This is something that we're not seeing in the other regulations yet, and I think opens up some very interesting opportunities to trade on this. "30 seconds left. So let's wrap it up. Going back to the onion here, the IMO short-term regs, whether they're sufficient to move the needle on carbon emissions, total carbon emissions in the shipping industry or not, they are by no means insignificant. They are going to, particularly the CIIs, are going to impact the value of vessels, the way they're operated, market rates. And again, it's differentiated. That I think for me, that's a really important one. Different routes, different vessels impacted to different amounts. Less efficient ships are going to be hit harder. This is going to impact operations. It's going to add levels of complexity. In the words of a lawyer, a shipping lawyer I spoke to the other day, he said that many counterparties in shipping are walking into a nightmare, sleepwalking into a nightmare, sorry. They don't realise that the potential contractual liabilities that these regulations are going to face to them. EU regulations, there's direct cost impacts from 2023. This is not the future, this is very soon, through the EU ETS and then later through, potentially through Fuel EU. Hope that was interesting in terms of the kind of the what's coming now in terms of regulations. Richard, I don't know if there's any questions, and then we can segue into the... the panel.
Very, very clearly explained, put an awful lot of information together into a digestible format for us. Before we do go into the panel discussion, I believe there's a question just here.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was an excellent presentation. I have 2 comments and then a question, if I may. The comments really are partially in defense of IMO, because actually IMO is now discussing well-to-wake, and it's also discussing carbon intensity.
Yes. Yep.
But we also have to remember that the EU Fit for 55 package, the ETS and the Fuel EU Maritime, that's still a proposal, and that's got to be negotiated by the member states and the Parliament. And most observers think the 2023 implementation date is very optimistic on the part of the Commission. Not to mention the objections, very strong objections, backlash from outside of the EU, but I'll just highlight that.
Yeah.
But my question, though, is where did you get the figure of 0.58 cents per marginal megajoule?
Megajoule.
That's in the regulation. I wasn't aware of that number.
It is, yes. Yes. The regulation does have a calculation for that cost, and that's where the 2,400 euros and the 5.8 euro cents per megajoule comes from. There are some, the draft of regulation, there's some issues with that. You're right, it's a proposal. And yeah, thanks for kind of crossing off the things. Yeah, very good point. These are proposals, so that those penalties could change. But I guess what we're seeing, the perspective we're seeing is we see a lot of political pressure to not materially change the quantum of impact of that. You're right, there could be some kind of delays in introducing those. We see potential delays in EU ETS more than Fuel EU Maritime implementation. But yeah, that's a very good point. And yeah, thanks for pointing out the IMO as well and looking to well-to-wake, because yeah.
There's actually 2 more questions come up. I'd say the first question is probably more relevant to hold for the panel discussion.
Yes.
If that makes sense to you.
That
Your
read my
panel,
mind.
so.
No, yeah, I want the panel to answer these then.
The second question, how the European Green Deal plays into your impact scenarios?
I don't know if I want to kind of leave that for the panel to discuss as well, but so the regulations that I've just spoken about here are part of the Fit for 55 proposal within EU. That is part of the regulation. Yep.
In that case, why don't we keep the questions for the panel discussion, because then we can have your comments and also the other panelists' discussion. On that note, we're going to move on to a panel discussion now, regulatory changes ahead, which I think Chris is very well led into. And so we have 4 fantastic panelists who I would kindly ask to join us on the stage right now. I think they're all 4 of them are mic'd up and ready to go. And Chris will do a better job than myself of introducing them and letting us know what all their different positions are and why they are such relevant people to listen to. Thank you. I understand that Jan was going to give a presentation to start, and so we'll let him take the stage straight away. Otherwise...
Have we got some microphones for the...
You're all wearing.
Oh, I noticed that.
It's the first time you've done this, Chris.
Yep.
Sorry. Chris was obviously moderating panels last year at the same conference.
It was like a long time
He's
ago.
a lot more experience with this than I do, so it's fun doing this. Jan, if you can just wait 2 seconds, we're getting the last microphone on, and then we'll let you get started.
Okay, yeah, in the interest of time, I think while Simon's getting set up, let me introduce everyone on the panel. So we'll start with ladies first. So Emma Skov Christiansen, who is the lead for shipping emissions and the ocean agenda at the World Economic Forum. Thanks for travelling the long distance it took you to get here. Marcio Moura, who is the Global Logistics Director at Bunge. Jan Hoffmann, who is our man at UNCTAD. Your official title is the Chief Trade Logistics Band at UNCTAD. And Simon Bennett, who's the Secretary General at the International Chamber of Shipping. Deputy. Thank you, Simon. We'll see how many times you can correct me by the end of this panel. Okay, we're going to start off. Jan's going to give a brief presentation on some of the work that he's done around impacts of some of the IMO regulations on the industry.
Good, yeah, thank you very much. I trust the microphone works. When we were preparing for the session with Chris like 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, I was the moderator and you were on the panel, and now you're the moderator, you're the boss. And we said it might actually be interesting to just share for 5 minutes when we discuss the regulation, what does this actually mean for you or for the countries? So my member governments, you people pay taxes to pay my salary, and I'm supposed to work for you. So the member governments of the IMO and of UNCTAD, before they implement a regulation, like the short-term measures that Chris just described in great detail, they want to know, what would this actually mean for my trade costs, my country's trade costs, my country's trade, my country's income? So to do this, in this particular case, the IMO asked UNCTAD, where I work, to do this impact assessment of the IMO short-term greenhouse gas reduction measure on states, the impact on states. So the IMO negotiates these short-term measures, as explained by Chris. The measures affect the cost and the speed of existing ships by 2030. We are not yet talking about new fuels, it's not long-term, it's not new or different ships, it's not market-based, it's really what Chris just explained. So before members are willing to agree on this short-term measure, they insisted on having a comprehensive impact assessment undertaken. So by doing a part of this impact assessment, we, UNCTAD, my team, we think we helped, A, to include the perspective of developing countries, those that will be affected, and we also think, and it has been confirmed, I would say, so that IMO members to even consider agree on the measure, because you will also remember, Chris, the member states have said we must know the impact before we can even agree on this. So what have we done? I will be very quick on this part. It was really a puzzle with many pieces. We had to put together the impact on ships, where we took input that was given us by DNV. So for every ship type, different ages, and we got actually more detailed tables than were published. What is the impact on the costs and the speed? This one we then had to combine with actual ships. We looked at every ship in the world, every journey of every ship in the world, where we then worked with marine traffic. So, for example, to put these two puzzle pieces together, this then looks, for example, like this. And we thought this was an interesting chart. So on the y-axis, you see what DNV gave us, and on the x-axis, you see what marine traffic gave us, and we combined this, and you could see for which ship type would the impact be how strong. So the bigger the bubble, the more the bigger are the ships, and the more to the right we are, the longer the journeys go. So it's not enough to just say which ship type is affected how much, but how much do they carry, how far do they carry it. This we then combine with trade. It was actually the biggest, the most difficult part, which trade from which country to which other country, which segment is moved on which ship, which is then we have to combine this with the shipping costs and the change in speed. Then we have to convert change in speed to dollars. If we had more time, we could discuss this. Very complicated. Then we had to see which part of the trade is actually maritime. Yeah. So there we had share of maritime. And then finally, we put this in our trade model. So there you have many Greek letters and a big simulation and general equilibrium model to have our output, what we were asked to do. What is the impact on states? So some annexes, demand supply, some other considerations. So what are the results? 3 main points. The first part, really now, for every country in the world, actually for every country pair and every trade pair, but just a summary, you could estimate the impact on the maritime logistics costs. The low case, which is here, is the scenario that was basically agreed by the IMO. So the world total impact is an increase in maritime logistics costs by 2030 of 2.7%. Okay? So we are comparing the world with IMO regulation vis-à-vis how would the world be without IMO regulation. And in our simulation, with all these puzzle pieces I just shared with you, says, okay, with the IMO regulation, maritime logistics costs, the cost of transport plus the cost of time, increase by 2.7%. What does this mean then for trade? Because if trade costs go up, trade will go down. This is the basis of all my work, all the work I'm doing about customs reform, port reforms, customs automation, all under the assumption if we improve transport, it's good for my member country's trade. So if we now increase transport cost or reduce the speed, it's not good for trade. So by order of magnitude, you see here the different countries. Those that are darker have a higher reduction in trade, and those that are lighter have a lower reduction in trade. So it depends on what type of product, from where to where, the distance that are affected. And what does this mean for your GDP? Here I share with you country groups. The green bar is the one that was basically agreed by the IMO. So just lean back without the exact numbers. It's really by order of magnitude, you have, say, 2% increase in costs, 0.2% reduction in trade, so order of magnitude 1 digit less, and 0.02% reduction in GDP. So that's always like 1 digit, order of magnitude, how these elasticities work. Conclusion, this was then discussed at length when we presented this to the IMO. This is a quote from the report: aggregate global impacts of the proposed IMO short-term measure on maritime logistics costs can be considered small when compared with the typical market variability in freight rates. You look at how it now went through the roof. Compared to how the freight rates went up and down these days, 2.7% is nothing, yeah? But, well, it's almost nothing. It's not nothing. Also, we do highlight the global impact on GDP and trade flows can be considered small when compared to the long-term negative impact of the pandemic or climate change. So we are not against these measures, but we were asked to assess the impact. And then this very last sentence I'm sharing here, this led to hours of discussions because we said, as a development agency, for some countries, the negative impacts of the IMO measure assessed in this report are relatively higher than for others. And it's mostly the poorer countries for whom this is stronger, including SIDS, sorry about the acronyms, Small Island Developing States and Least Developed Countries. UNCTAD expects that some countries will likely require support to mitigate the increased maritime logistics costs and alleviate the consequent negative impact on their income and trade flows. So the poorest, weakest countries, who are on the one hand often the same ones that are most affected by climate change. Yeah? I've been to the Marshall Islands, I've been to the Maldives for work. And they're that much about sea level. So they are worried. They do not want to block this. They want ambitious goals, ambitious regulation that we will discuss at the IMO. But they are also very, very worried. They're really nervous. The policymakers have sleepless nights. What if I now promote this solution because I want to fight climate change, and as a result, my country will no longer be served by shipping because speeds will go down even further, costs will go up. The old ships that serve the Pacific Islands, they will be the first ones, as Chris just explained, that drop out. So they are really worried. And all we can do, well, he did this assessment. That's how it looks like. It's a simulation. It's a simulation only on the short-term measures, which have been criticized for not being very ambitious. We need far more ambitious. But I hope you found it interesting, so the order of magnitude, the multipliers, and the direction of impact is what we have assessed in this report. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan. I think it's a really important point about kind of impacts on developing nations and trade, and I'd kind of like to circle back to that maybe a bit kind of further into the discussions. But we'll start off with kind of giving everyone a chance to kind of join the conversation here. So I was going to start with you, Emma. You've been involved in the Getting to Zero coalition and the recent announcement a few weeks ago, the call to action. Can you give a brief kind of summary of the initiative, what it is for the audience and why it's needed?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So basically the call to action was initiated over the summer, and just 2 weeks ago we launched it together with the UN during the UN General Assembly opening. And it is 160 plus companies from across the maritime value chain, so everyone from your financiers, insurers, down to your energy suppliers who've signed up with very clear commitments to how they intend to and have strategized to decarbonize shipping. The call to action is really a call on governments to set very clear targets. So clear targets for 2050, being zero by mid-century, but also a call on governments to do what they can do today in terms of domestic, regional, etc., plurilateralism in terms of both regulation, but also in terms of collaboration. And then third and foremost, I think it's a really good signal, and it's a really good signal 2 years after we launched the Getting to Zero coalition, that industry is putting a lot of action behind their word. It's not the shipping industry on their own, it's the many industries across the value chain. So that's really what the call to action is, and I invite everyone here who hasn't already to sign up or find me after to learn more. Great,
thanks. Marcio, you're a customer of the shipping industry here. Your business is moving freight and supplying goods. I think you're involved in the call to action as well. You've signed up.
Yeah.
So, from your perspective, as a user of shipping and freight, is the industry moving in the right direction? Is the IMO moving fast enough for your needs?
I think first we have to understand that IMO is doing a great job, because it's quite difficult to move all the countries in the same direction with so many different interests. So we have to thank them for all the action. So that's no doubt. Of course, that when we are looking at the demand of the industry itself, we would like to see a more ambitious targets from IMO. And if I can add the perspective of the customer, we as customers of the freight, of the owner, we are looking for decarbonization. In our chartering activities, and the charter being a part of the supply chain of Bunge, besides the farmer, the emissions on farm, logistics is the biggest emitter for Bunge. So this is why this discussion on the emissions is under the logistics and the whole value chain of Bunge. So looking at the customer perspective, if you look to the customers of Bunge, which we can name PepsiCo or Nestle or McDonald's, you can see they have clear commitments to decarbonize. And their commitment will go through our commitment that will go down to owners' commitment. So there is a push not only from us as customers of the owner, but our customers are demanding that from us. So in the end, you're going to have to move it together. We will not be able to move alone. We have to help our customer, and we have to be helped by the owners and the industry.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. I don't know if this is a bit cheeky, are your customers willing, because Jan was talking about kind of impacts of regulations and increased cost. Are your customers showing signs of being willing to pay extra for low or zero carbon yet? Or is that, that a difficult question?
It is a difficult question. I think there is some parts of the supply chain already understanding that you need to participate on the cost. We are working with our customers when they want to know if a beans is coming from a deforestation. There are some customers they only want the tracking. There are others they want the certification. Which is the certification, then there is a cost. Eventually, they will accept that cost. But in general, the shipping, if you're talking about ocean shipping, there is no yet willingness to pay for a different price for that leg of the supply chain. So, but we see the movement growing, and we see that we are going to get there. If it's 1 year from today or 5, but we are approaching to that moment that a big food company in Asia will be determining to the guy producing the chicken that he wants the full supply chain, and he will be willing to pay a premium for that. And we hope so, at least.
And sorry, I'm not picking on you, Marcio, but how important then is a level playing field in terms of regulations really important there? Because if you're saying the customers are maybe hesitant about absorbing that cost, is the idea of having a level playing field where all people are impacted the same amount?
I think it's very important. This is why we have also, to understand that the European Union cannot be waiting for the IMO, and they are moving in the direction they think will speed up the decarbonization. But talking about level playing field, as a cargo owner, we would prefer to have a impactful but simple way of paying for the decarbonization. And this is why it would be better if we have those regulations at IMO level, because it would not only be applicable to Europe but to the global flows as one. So we would be much happier if that would come from the IMO. Yeah.
Okay, Simon, I don't know if you want to have a go at Richard's question there about. While we're sticking on the theme of passing on costs through the supply chain, do you think it's possible with the current regulations? Does that enable ship owners to pass those costs through the value chain, or is there additional burden put on ship owners at the moment?
Well, you've caught me on the spot. I think ultimately, I think that's a question for society at large. When this will come up in the conversation, but. On the one hand, we're told constantly about the climate emergency and the need to do everything that we can to decarbonise. And in the industry, we've got the message. Our own organisation, we just made an announcement today, an hour ago, I think, to confirm that the International Chamber of Shipping backs a net zero target. But on the other hand, that's got to be balanced with the economic cost, and ultimately that's a decision that has to be made by governments. But just picking up on the point made before, I'm not a cynic. I believe in decarbonising the industry. However, I think there is sometimes a disconnect, if I may say so, between the signals of virtue from some of our CEOs and those who actually negotiate contracts at the coalface. And that's always been the case. It's not just on decarbonisation, but we're optimistic, and I think that's my main point on that question.
Yeah. Okay. So another. I'm going to get to these. There's lots of good questions. You guys have got better questions than me. Before we get to that, Simon, I mean, ICS is, I think, is quite active and very closely involved in the IMO always, and particularly recently, and you're involved in several of the submissions that have been put through in previous MEPC and will be discussed further at MEPC 77. Do you want to kind of talk a bit about some of...
Very briefly, I mean, just so you understand, ICS, we represent the world's national ship owners associations, and we've been doing it for 100 years, actually. It's our centenary year this year. But the IMO meeting coming up in November, it's going to be a really critical meeting, because the whole spotlight of the world is going to be on IMO, which that meeting takes place 2 weeks after the UN Climate Change Conference. But there's really 3 big issues on the table. Number one, of most critical importance, is that the IMO approves the proposal that originally came from the industry, but is now backed by a wide cross-section of governments, including Switzerland, I should say, for a $5 billion IMO research and development fund. And the reason why we need this is because, as you've been discussing all week, the scale of the challenge is just so enormous. The time we have to do it is so short. And we've identified across the industry that the technology readiness levels simply aren't mature enough. Given the 25-year life of ships, we need to have large numbers, really thousands, of zero-carbon ships on the water by the beginning of the next decade. And we just simply don't think we're going to get there. Someone earlier mentioned moonshots. It really is on that scale, and that's why the industry has come together to agree they're willing to pay a levy of $2 a ton of fuel solely for the purpose of accelerating research and development. So that's the number one, from our perspective, that's the number one decision for the governments. And the criticism shouldn't be of IMO, it should be of the governments who form the membership of IMO when people say they're moving too slowly. Because these are the same governments that sit around the table at UNFCCC. Quickly, the other 2 big issues are that there'll be beginning discussions about market-based measures, and again, ICS, we've come forward with a comprehensive proposal for a carbon levy for shipping, setting out how the architecture would work, because we accept the argument that we need a price signal to expedite the take-up of new zero-carbon fuels. And then third and finally, there will be beginning discussions about setting a revised target for the sector, and that comes in with the point that we've already made about the industry's support now for a net zero target for 2050, which is a hugely ambitious target, and we have no illusions about that.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot. And yeah, I just realized, I'm trying to count in my head how many times I said that the IMO has been criticized for not moving fast enough in my presentation.
Only once, and that was too often. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I didn't mean, yeah. I think you raised some really good points. One is the IMO, as one of my colleagues says, the IMO is a building almost, plus a secretariat. The decisions are made by the member states at the IMO. And yeah, secondly, I wasn't personally criticizing, but there is, I think there is increased pressure from outside the industry to move, which we can see in terms of the EU's kind of progress forward on regionalised regulations. I'm conscious that I think we're looking at this from an internal kind of lens on shipping, and we had some comments in the last few days about the fact that we are a consumer, we will be a potential consumer of green energy. I think someone mentioned yesterday, total shipping consumption is around 2% of the global energy demand. We're not, well, we've heard some different views on that. We're not the biggest consumer, but then again, we can potentially produce a decent kind of demand signal. Emma, what can we learn from kind of other industries and what's going on in the rest of the world in terms of shipping?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah. I'll try to uncover. I think what's interesting is to look at shipping as part of the industry, broader industry and energy transition, right? So we know that in order to scale the net zero fuels that we need to decarbonize by 2050, we need 5% zero emission fuels to be part of the mix by 2030. But how are we going to get there? We have other industries looking hard to abate, sectors looking to solve the same problem. And all of them looking at green hydrogen, to some extent blue hydrogen being part of their solution. We know, or we will be launching this very soon in the transition strategy from the Getting to Zero Coalition, that in order to just reach shipping's demand for zero carbon fuels, you'll need to build 30 new power plants for green hydrogen a year in the next, I believe we're saying 10 to 15 years to bring it up to scale, and of course drive down cost. So that's one of the other opportunities of looking at what other industries are doing, because you can drive economies of scale, you can de-risk. What I like to say is that, again, I know I have a big focus on government action, but shipping is a fairly safe place to start looking for the hydrogen plants you're looking to build, the supply you're looking to supply, and say, okay, yes, this will go on board ships. And why am I saying that? I'm saying it's lower risk, because when you look at, for example, land freight or e-mobility, yes, there's a discussion of that being hydrogen off-takers. However, not fully, because you still have an uncertainty around electrification.
Okay.
So this is, of course, for deep sea shipping, where we know that zero-emission fuels are, or the solutions are in zero-emission fuels or low-emission fuels. They're not in batteries due to volume, etc. So I think it's interesting to follow what goes on both in the materials sector, in the road sector, in aviation, who are coming up with a lot of interesting mechanisms. Standardization for book and claim systems will be needed across modes as well to enable this. And I think there is a lot of kind of knowledge sharing, best practice sharing happening across sectors at the moment, but it's something that we need to continue to build the bridges across those sectors for sure, and learn from each other as we go.
Yeah, very good point. Thanks. And sorry, did you? No. So Jan, I mean, you spoke about impacts of regulations at the same time, and kind of following on from what Emma was saying, are there opportunities for developing countries here around supply of alternative fuels, particularly and particularly linked to the shipping sector here as well?
Yeah, no, there have been quite detailed studies also with the Getting to Zero Coalition Global Maritime Forum. The World Bank has been very active. We have collaborated. Actually, a lot of the potential suppliers of the whatever power-to-X solution are Mexico, Morocco, Chile, Southeast Asia. So there definitely is potential. And I mean, to get there, I do want to comment and congratulate ICS and Simon. You have not always been publicly a fan of a levy and of the solution. I think this is really the right step. It is the right step because then it is you here in the room who will all get the right incentive that your solutions become competitive. We don't want IMO to say, I want the solution of Sirocco, or I want the solution of Carbotech, I want the solution of GDT, or whatever, like a command and control solution. I want the price on carbon so that all the solutions that were presented here yesterday and today become competitive. No? And then in the end, another thing why I'm in favor, and that maybe links back to your initial question, or the research fund, but also investing in the new, helping developing countries in particular, also to invest, to compensate, to become energy provider. So any fund that receives funding, money from the levy, can be reinvested to help with the transition, be it in research, but also be it in the country. So the future regulation, we need three things. It needs to be the right regulation, number one, and I feel strongly positive towards a price, a levy for carbon. Second, it needs to be a multilateral solution. We don't want the regional, national, small, it needs to be multilateral. And thirdly, we need to have it soon and clear and predictable. And this is really so important. This, for me, was a key point that came out of our impact study, that if ships go slower, we will actually need more ships. If, as you, Chris, explained, ships will need to be demolished earlier, we will need more ships. If, on the other hand, we don't know what technology, what is the framework, the ship owners, members of ICS, will wait. And then the current situation of very high freight rates might get worse, because right now we have the steep supply curve, speaking as an economist, which has moved to the left, and we don't want this. So we need the right regulation, multilateral, and soon and clear regulation.
Yeah.
If I can add, I think your point is what worries charters most of today. You know, that transition for the new ships, net zero emission, or you know, how this is going to imply in the supply and demand of ships is what we are trying to really understand. And for us, it's a bit difficult because we are not the owners of the ship, and then we have to understand how the market is going and where the ships are and which ships we're going to be chartering tomorrow. But that's the fundamental question we have today. It's not if we are going to, because we are favored to have one levy and not these regional tax schemes. It is really about how I'm going to be able to have the supply when I need. And the supply of the ships is becoming something that you need to solve soon because of the things you explained. So that's really, really a concern for us today.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think it's just that lack of certainty and clarity about the future that's...
If I may just pick up on the proposal that ICS has made to IMO about a carbon levy, and that's a carbon levy as distinct from a cap and trade system, which you mentioned earlier, Chris, and you explained very eloquently how that will work. And the reason why the industry is so upset about this proposal is, one, it's a regional regulation, and we can't have piecemeal regulations. We're a global industry. But also, as I think it was a question asked just now, the problem with trading systems is that the carbon price is variable. You have no certainty. And if you look at the history of the ETS or national trading systems, the price goes up, but sometimes it can go down, and sometimes it can crash completely. And it's completely inappropriate for an industry like shipping, where, leaving aside the bigger players like MSC, the majority of shipping companies are small SMEs, typically operating 6 ships, and they can't cope with the complications of volatility, of carbon pricing, and the complications of how you pass that down the supply chain. So that's why we're so keen to make progress on a levy rather than a trading system.
Can I, again, I'm sorry if I keep adding on it, but another important point is this one, because the price of the carbon today it has been increasing a lot. So if you see our industry, that is a simple industry, you crush the beans or the canola and you have oil and something on the other side, we cannot dissociate that of the economic and social impact on the environment umbrella that we can have. Because we may have, if the price of the carbon grows a lot, you may have industries in Europe that cannot compete anymore with industries in other regions. And one of the industries is even ours, because if you grow a lot the price of the carbon, it's going to be cheaper you import the soybean meal from other countries than producing the meal and the oil here in Europe. So that is also something that I think our industry is looking and talking to our federation to see, to make a sound alarming around on that problematic that can soon come, because if everybody's buying carbon credits for everything, you see the price is going to be too high one day. Yeah.
I think we agree, and again, the proposal we've made to IMO, it's relatively new and people are digesting it, but we're not proposing a fixed carbon price forever, so it would be a fixed levy, but we've suggested a 5-year period, and then every 5 years you would have a ratchet that would take account of developments in technology. Because if you're going to have a carbon price to incentivize transition, you have to actually have the technology to transition to. Otherwise, the whole thing just turns into a revenue-raising exercise. And again, this is our concern with the ETS, be quite frank about it. It's been politically motivated from the top, and what excites the European establishment is that huge sums of money are going to come in from foreign ship owners to support EU governments. And none of this money will actually help with the decarbonisation of shipping.
And I think they've actually been clear. Well, I think some of it will go towards, but I think they've been clear that where those funds are going to go. And like you said,
I'm not disagreeing with you. I disagree with them. But again, this is the way the European Commission works. It's so confusing that the detail sort of bores everyone into submission. But on the one hand, they talk about money going to innovation funds, some of which may or may not end up going to shipping, but it won't be going to the majority of ship operators paying into the EU ETS will be based outside of the European Union. So it's basically a tax on trade. But the EU Council last summer, in the middle of the COVID crisis, they confirmed, excellent, this money can be used to help the COVID recovery programs.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was going to say. I think they were clear that actually it is going to fund COVID recovery and other things outside of shipping. So you're kind of linking back to one of the questions here about who collects the funds from Peter, who collects the funds and who decides where they go and how much. So your proposal that you've put into the IMO about the fuel levy, is that specific about what happens with those funds?
So I'm going to monopolise the conversation, but very quickly, all IMO regulations relate to the ship. So the regulation would apply to the ship, and the ship would be responsible, or the ship owner would be responsible for the transmission of the payment to an IMO fund. But of course, the actual cost of whether it's a levy for R&D, but more importantly, the cost of a carbon price would be passed down the supply chain. So in the bulk sector in particular, you'd expect it to be a feature of charter party contracts. And in fairness, the same principle is recognised with the EU ETS, where the Commission have indicated they expect that the costs of carbon allowances to be passed down the supply chain to ship owners' customers.
All right. I think in terms of people, I think there's too much agreement on the panel about fuel levies and price volatility of carbon prices. So I think we've got to go to Martin's question here about the fact that the shipping markets are already dealing with variable prices and price uncertainty around charter rates and bunker costs. And this is kind of a question for anyone on the panel. What makes a fluctuating carbon price? If you're dealing with that uncertainty already with the ship owners, what are the specific reasons for wanting
I was hoping somebody else would answer that question first. My stab at it would be that ship owners are already managing large numbers of different types of risks, and we all know what they are. But this adds yet another one. But it's the complication of carbon prices, because you have the volatility of carbon prices in the short term, but that may follow a different time period to what's covered by the freight contract. But it's not just, the problem isn't just for ship owners, it's also for governments. You have to, again, going back to IMO, you have to remember, IMO, half the membership comprises developing countries who've got legitimate concerns about the impacts on trade. They're willing to go along with the program as long as they have certainty about what the impacts are, as Jan was describing. Whereas if you have massive volatility in carbon prices, it creates all kinds of questions for them. Also, Jan talked very eloquently about the impact assessment that UNCTAD did for IMO. How do you do an impact assessment of a cap and trade system when you don't know what the carbon price is? Whereas you have a levy, we don't really mind particularly what the level of that levy is. That would be a political decision, as long as it's not outrageously ridiculous. But at least you can do a proper impact assessment and say, if it's $100 a ton of CO2, or if it's $200 a ton of CO2, you can have a go at seeing what the broader macroeconomic impacts are going to be. Because they will be significant for many developing countries.
I think that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it. Thanks.
Yeah, gonna compliment this. Yeah, no. conceptually, theoretically, from an economist perspective, having a market price for something sounds okay. So I don't have a problem in principle, but there are actually numerous studies by World Maritime Fund, GIZ, the German agency, this GIZ, World Bank, universities. And I want to quote Laurent, who said yesterday he was not in favor of market-based measures, but he really meant only the trading scheme. He did not mean the levy when he said, because in the IMO, sometimes they're all put together, they're all called MBMs, market-based measures. But I agree, this is a quite fundamental difference in the concept. And levy has many of the advantages you described, and studies have shown they are more cost-effective in the sense of you want to create the right incentive, there's a cost to it, and there are numerous studies who show they are more cost-effective.
Yeah, I think from a, in our chartering activities, I'm not talking now as the whole supply chain and the cost of carbon, but as a chartering activity, we are, we like volatility, which helps in other things, and managing one more volatility. If you can hedge that volatility, it would not be a problem really. But because in the end we are going to have to pay for that CO2, but the instruments need to be there to, in size, so you are able to hedge the volatility that you're going to have and the size you're going to have. At any given year, we are carrying about 65 million tons, being almost 50 million of our in-house cargoes, and that volume needs some kind of hedging if you have a global levy on that. So.
Just very quickly to respond to Richard's question, because we conclude. In our study, in our estimations, assume all extra costs will be passed on by the owners in the end to the trade cost. And yes, in our economic general equilibrium study, the modeling, like we are assuming 2030, so there's enough time. So in our modeling, we do assume that costs, higher fuels, time costs, whatever, in the end will be paid for by the customer. Now, that is the assumption we make. We can discuss, but the answer to this question, yes, we assumed they will all be passed on. In the end, the customer will pay.
Thanks. I'm trying to. There's too many good questions.
The net zero one is maybe a pertinent one.
Yeah.
But others may have different views. But just to be remembering, we've only made the announcement today, but our interpretation of a net zero target for 2050 is we're talking about net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And the reason we've defined it like that is because we think that's consistent with the emphasis given in the discussions at UNFCCC and what's it called, the IPCC, and their focus is very much on zero carbon for 2050. But in essence, although we believe in moving to net zero, as ship owners' representatives, it's important that we keep as many options open as to how we achieve that target. So we thought very carefully, and there's a more detailed paper that's going into IMO, which explains what we mean by net zero, but we want to keep open as many different alternative fuel options. It gets all complicated. You've been discussing it this week about life cycle analysis, biofuels, methanol. What we are opposed to is this madness that's coming from the likes of the United States, United Kingdom, and Norway, who frankly should know better, who seem to be talking about absolute reductions by 2050. How you achieve an absolute reduction, I really don't know, unless they want us all to convert to nuclear power. But I think that's an important distinction between absolute and net, and then there's discussion to be had about the detail of what's embraced by that net zero.
Just to add to that, I totally agree. I think one of the distinctions that we're using in our work is that we say we need to ensure the first zero-emission vessels are entering the fleet by 2030, recognizing they'll be powered by net zero fuels, and it is down to those life cycle assessments. So it's really in the technicalities of how much carbon and how much gas you can take out of the production line of your future fuels. So, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there. I think there's a lot of being absolute, etc. But generally, and we saw it coming out of UN Climate Week just 2 weeks ago, that the net zero fuels does cover the fuel options that we saw you present earlier, right? On your lower, so your e-ammonia, your e-methanol. I think biofuels is a whole other conversation, because again, it depends on supply, but we know that the two-stroke engines are there. Another interesting conversation here is retrofitting. Vessels built today should be built to be retrofitted, most likely. It's a multi-fuel future, but what it is exactly, we don't know, but we need to figure it out, and I think governments outside of the IMO can already now start incentivizing, whether that's regionally or domestically, right? So we're seeing alliances in United States together with Japan, Australia, and India just announced green shipping corridors 2 weeks ago. Like, the signaling is there, large-scale demonstration projects are being put on the water. The finance mechanisms are slowly following as well, and we know what it will take. We know that it will take approximately $1 trillion to decarbonize deep sea shipping, and that 87% of that investment is in land-based infrastructure. So there are regions in the world where the subsidies for scaling up renewables for production of zero-emission fuels are already there, but there are other places where we still need to see the incentives, you could say.
If I can go back to the beginning of the conversation now, and again, just reiterate, it's really, really important that IMO approves this research fund, because again, I mean, I assume Getting to Zero Coalition supports the establishment of the IMRF at IMO, so I'm not clear about that, but I presume that's the case.
Yes, let's say yes and then see the breakdown of a few things, but generally...
Well, it's a binary question, because it's going to be at IMO, governments are going to be considering it, so it'd be really good to see the Getting to Zero Coalition getting behind the call to set up this fund, because, again, to reiterate, I just think governments just don't understand the scale of the challenge that they're setting us. And that we've just got so little time to do what is required to be done in terms of developing the technology to make it work on the ships before we even start talking about rolling out the bunkering infrastructure throughout the world. And above all, as you've identified this week, no one knows what the pathway is. Lots of people say, oh, ammonia seems to be very attractive, but we could suddenly find in 10 years' time that we've taken a completely wrong turn, and actually the solution was in a different direction, in liquefied hydrogen. And so that's another reason why we need this fund, so that we can actually really work out what the pathway is likely to be. So as an industry, we've actually got some certainty as to what assets we're expected to invest in. Because once we get to the end of this decade, we'll have lost our opportunity, because 2050 will be on us before we know it.
So I think we're all talking about the need. Are we?
Oh. We're going to have to slowly bring it to a close, unfortunately.
Okay. Sorry, I got the timing wrong. Can I wrap up with one question for everyone to ask, Richard? Is that all right? And sorry, that was really interesting. We can explore that in the bar afterwards. What I wanted to ask everyone, what's good look like for you? So what regulations do we need? If you could wave your magic wand and regulatory wand and get one change or one thing implemented to really drive this forward, get the change that we need, what would that be? I'll start at the end. Yeah.
I had alluded to some of these, like, three thoughts. Get it right. And I personally, being an economist, and once upon a time I worked for the IMO, and I was the only economist at the IMO. This having economic incentives for me the right way. Then second has to be multilateral regulation, and the third, clear and early, so that all of us can plan.
Yeah, not much to add. I think for us, it's to avoid the multilateral type of regulation. I think we are looking for a market-based measure. I don't think there is an opposition to the fund, as you mentioned. I think when we address the IMO is that the $2 looks insufficient for what the industry needs. So I actually think the industry is saying the other way around. There is a support, but not supporting the, because it's going to be tough to legislate for a $200, $250 DV, and the $2 looks insufficient. So, and this is why you are seeing much proliferation of legislation. Imagine that tomorrow US also comes to to legislation something different than EU and so on and so on. So for us would be one global MBM, and the way is the way to go.
I think a little bit to Simon's point earlier, I look and hope and really to see that the way that we'll see NDCs being negotiated during COP26 will spill over to what we're seeing in the MEPC. So that alignment in governments between the NDCs and the MEPC and IMO negotiations, I hope that's something we'll see a broader alignment in, and that will help a lot of what we discussed here.
We couldn't really ask for better timing, could we, in terms of having COP26, I think, just before MEPC?
Makes some of us busy, hey?
Yeah,
But no, it's
easy
great.
from our perspective.
It's great momentum indeed.
And Simon?
Well, I've sort of spoken too much, so I'll just say global, well-considered and realistic, let's hope.
Great, thanks. Well, I hope that was really interesting. I think for me it's really encouraging. We've got 4 different stakeholders from the industry here, that a few of the details probably we still need to flesh out, but I think everyone is really on the same page here and positive in terms of what needs to be done. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. We have last 2 sessions of the afternoon. We've covered an awful lot over the last day and a half, and it's been very, very interesting discussions, very interesting. The panel discussion we just had was fascinating. It dragged on a little bit longer than expected just because it was such an interesting discussion. We are going to finish up with the afternoon with 2 more very interesting discussions. In fact, one is first going to be a presentation looking at COVID-19, monitoring the crew's health and well-being to preserve marine business sustainability, incredibly important. And I think it's something that's very, very often overlooked. We're then going to have a number of presentations, which is going to be introduced by Olivier Straub, who's here today with the Swiss Ship Owners Association, and that's going to be looking into the sources of funding for technological developments. So we're going to start off right now. If you could please welcome to the stage Dr. Vladimiro Bonamin from SGS. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening. First of all, thank you to remain here. Normally, the last presentation, there are less than 20% of the people, but today you are basically nearly all like this morning. Here we talk about sustainability. We talk about cost, new services, new fuels, new way to push the ships. But basically no one talk sustainability on the other side, that to push ships, we need also the personnel, we need also the crew. Not that the crew is affected by the fuel, even if I am some concern about the potential risk using hydrogen, using other fuel that can be dangerous, but okay, it's not the matter of discussion for today. Where you have to point? No, it's here. Okay, basically, I am talking of something that is in the reality already old, already existing, that is the Maritime Labour Convention. It's a convention that was made together by IMO and ILO. ILO is an office of United Nations here in Geneva and is the International Labour Organization. Basically, this kind of convention bring for the seafarers some additional right. And this is to protect them from particular condition on the ships. I want to say I am not here to talk about the worker exposure. I am not talking about the time that the seafarers is passing at work. I am talking of the remaining time that seafarers is passing during his rest time, when he's in his cabin, when he's using the shower, when he take his food, because the other area is regulated by other regulation. In any case, this convention on one side is protecting also the ship owners, because to have the people happy and the people that like to stay on board obviously is an advantage also for them. Just to remember that the convention was ratified by 97 countries, and basically 91% of the world gross tonnage have approved. And the convention entered in force in 2013. That means 9 years ago. Why to talk only now? There is a reason why to talk only now. In addition to this, we have this kind of obligation, that is the ship sanitation certification. That is, as you can see here in the first point, is aimed to control the spread of human disease. This obviously starting from the time of the Black Pest is checking the transportation of roeditors, rats, but is also checking the quality of the drinking water that can bring potential disease like Vibrio cholera or similar, the sewage, and then at the end the disease that can be transported by the person themselves. And this certificate also have a special rule on how have to be issued. This is an example that is coming from the Memorandum of Understanding of Paris that show the number of deficiencies that was found, that was fined, that bring in some cases to detention of the ships. And here you can see that we have a large amount of situation with the room or too cold or too warm or not cleaned enough. Then we have sometimes no real sanitary facilities. That means toilet, means shower or similar. Then the galley, the quality of the food, and so on and so on. Obviously, there is a list, and we have no real detailed regulation that can define specific criteria for the acceptance. But probably there are situations that are totally worse. Difficult to say, it's difficult to verify, but apparently something of like that exists, and this is something that potentially can affect the life of the people out of the hour of works. Why 2013? All taken a kind of acceleration due to COVID, due to the pandemic period. There was this letter from the General Secretary of IMO that started to say that because the crew have to stay more longer on board of the ship due to the difficulty of travel, due to the need of quarantine, due to countries that don't allow it to disembark or to re-embark, the ship owner have to take in good account the health and the well-being of the crew. He issued the note that you can see on December 2020, just in the, I want to say, is in the heart of the pandemic, and basically says that this kind of situation have to be taken in account. what need at this point the ship owner, in my opinion, need or a certain level of self-capability into decide what means in a decent condition to live on board for a long period, or can take help from class, from consultant, from medical doctor, depends from he decide to consider. Us at SGS having a good tradition in indoor air quality and in workplace consultancy, after a lot of requirements from shipping company, all initially linked to the COVID-19, we started to put in place a kind of program that at the moment is not equal for each client, because each client is coming with specific request. Large of this was on how to manage the COVID risk. There are other examples. For example, I know that Rina have made the one for cruise, but this is 90% addressed to the passenger and to help the restarting of the cruise. While here we are talking of the 10, 15, 20 people of the crew, starting from the commander going down to the last of in the chain. Basically, we have prepared a kind of protocol, and we have also prepared what is asked by the regulation, that is also the information part. Preparing a kind of mark with the QR code that can be accessible to everybody, where the people can know that something was done, not what was exactly done, but that something was done in this sense. What basically we are doing in our proposal, I want to say, is medium value, because we have a totally different request. Just I want to give an example. For companies that are shipping in Southeast Asia, they ask the control of humidity and control of the temperature in the room. But for ships that are ranging in the Baltic Sea or North Sea, they are exactly asking the reverse. By the way, it's not really equal for all, but typically we have set up a twice a year 4-5 hour inspection that is not really delaying any operation on board. We do a rapid verification of the documentation, and we make a tour. We make a tour on the galley, we make a tour on the room, on the toilet, on the shower, and we try to make an evaluation about the food and drinking supplies, how they are preserved, how they are kept. Obviously, they have all the, there are regulations on the conservation and preservation of the food, and there is also a kind of paper verification, but there are a lot of other situations to verify if the fridge is a fridge and really keep the food below 4 Celsius, then the accommodation, the cleanliness, and then we have obviously clients that are asking in the room the presence of asbestos in the air. We have clients that are asking the mold in the air, and they are asking if the mold can generate allergies, because the allergies is one of the apparently health status more frequently claimed as a potential moment of risk for the people. And then we have a final reporting that normally is done in front and in agreement with the captain, or at least with the knowledge of the captain. And normally we put all the findings, positive and negative. And then the final report with the recommendation. Obviously, there are no, from our side, any obligation put to the captain in to make a remediation. Is not obliged, but obviously is encouraged to try to solve the findings. The little experience we have accumulated, we are not talking about cost. We are talking about changing in procedure, changing in what they do, with not really generating cost, just a change in the style of conduct the maintenance and how is run the kitchen or the galley, and like that. There are cultural aspects because we receive from a master the critics that some of the crew, when they go home, they live in worse condition than when they stay on board of the ships. But this is not a correct reason. First of all, we don't need to know where the people are living normally, where they are coming. We are following a general idea. Normally, with the visual inspection, we make also some rapid on-site measurement that are some, obviously, water testing, at least for the drinking water. We do some indoor air quality fast test for mold, for bacteria in air. We use adenosine triphosphate for make a verification of the cleanliness of the surface to avoid accumulation of fungi or bacteria or spores. There we do some noise measurement. I repeat, not in the engine room where is there obviously noisy, but there became worker exposure. It's a totally different situation. We are talking of the remaining 10, 12 hours that the people are not working. And then COVID test. COVID test, obviously, as I said before, was the initiator of this, or the restarting of this. They never start at the time of the ratification of the convention. And typically, we are performing three kinds of tests. We are performing test of COVID on the surface. You have to know that in one ship there are a lot of handrails. And all the people going up and down are keeping the hand on the handrails, on the styre. And this is one of the places that is considered vehicle of infection, or just the button to push to flush the water of the toilet is an important point of contamination. Then we are doing a COVID test on the sewage water, because it's in a way to take one sample and to test all the people that are on the ships and tell to the captain that someone now is infected. And then to pass to the classic antigenic test or eventually PCR test for the individual people using, in that case, a medical doctor or a professional nurses. Obviously, we have the possibility from each of the twice inspection to generate a comprehensive final report. Here you can see an idea of the status. We have the procedure that are normally analyzed with a specific client, because each client have different desire. Obviously, there are a gap analysis to see if the procedure is still valid, is enough valid. Then we start with the program of survey and testing, and then eventually we give the mark that allow when it's scanned, even to the crew, to know that a test was done. And then there are the additional tests that I mentioned before. The mark. The mark at the moment have a limited value because it's a private mark, but it helps. It helps to give at least the impression to the crew or a new crew that something is done in their favor, following an existing and ratified convention. Typically, we don't give through the QR code the total access to the report to everybody that go on board. This one is under password only for the managers of the company that have the responsibility to maintain good situation, and this is done with all the security. Some information that you can have on the simple QR code is the explanation of the program, are the program date, the date of the last inspection, the port of call of the last inspection, while the full report is available only to the people that run the password. In summary, health and well-being monitoring program should to improve the condition of life of the crew. In certain way, take the ship owner to avoid potential fining, detention, or in any case, negative feedback. Whereas an SGS mark that is like any other mark of an important inspection company can give some credibility, at least at the eyes of the inspector or the crew. And then there are also some other benefits linked to the drinking water and similar things. For example, now we have conducted tests in more than 300 ports around the world. Typically, we follow the guideline of WHO. If you know, the IMO regulation on the drinking water is asking to follow the rules of the flag state. And here the situation is complicated because in Europe we have one regulation valid for all the country. But if you go to a flag like Norway, the regulation is incredibly heavy. I've never seen something like that. US is relatively heavy, but if you go to a lot of other countries, they don't have regulation. By the way, there we follow the guideline of WHO related to the drinking water. Then, as you see, one of the relatively important issues is the Legionella. Legionella is a kind of bacteria that is developed in the pipeline of the water mainly, or in the pipeline of the air conditioning or air ventilation, where there is a formation of bacteriological amoeba. There is also the potential risk of the formation and the accumulation of Legionella. Not all the Legionella are dangerous, are pathogenic for the human. Only the so-called Pneumophila Legionella is dangerous. But okay, this is something that we go to check. Here some information on, this is a stupid argument, but in reality is important. These are the time that need to pass from the maximum time. They need to pass from the moment of the sampling and the moment of the start of the analysis. This can be very critical, because sometimes the people take the sample and ship by DHL and arrive to the lab 5 days after. And this is for nothing. Take the sample and throw in the wastewater, make no sense. While it's already heavy, because 30 hours at 10 degrees is already too much. In US, it's 6 hours at 4 degrees, just to give an idea. But WHO says that this is still acceptable. These are other parameters that we do in air, depending case by case on requirement of the ships. In this moment, and is not indicated here, the most important remain asbestos. Remain asbestos because there are a lot of ships that still have somewhere asbestos insulation. Many have removed the asbestos, but many still have residual of asbestos. This is linked to the sanification of the handrails that looks like a potential way of infection if you have the infected people. Yeah. Because if all the people are not infected, obviously there's no the risk. But suppose that there is a port state control that enter and the guy is infected, some other things, I don't want to say nothing more. Well, these are our network where we work and the different service we are now providing to the maritime sector, like some other of our competitors. That's all. Thank you.
Vladimiro, it breaks my heart to have to bring to a close there because I think it is such an important issue, and I think you guys are doing a great job to provide some kind of clarity in this. Unfortunately, because of time constraints, we're going to have to move on. So if you could please all join me in saying an enormous thank you to Vladimiro. Thank you. So now we're moving on to the last session of the day, and we're going to have a couple of presentations. In fact, first of all, we're going to have Olivier Straub, who's joining us here today as the Secretary General of the Swiss Shipowners Association. We also have from PwC Switzerland, Patricia Moore, who's in charge of the International Tax Services, and also Dr. Antonios Koumbarakis, who is Director of Sustainable and Strategic Development. So could you please join me on the stage, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for staying with us for the this last session. I do hope that we will keep you awake for this presentation. So I am Olivier Straub, General Secretary of the Swiss Shipowners Association, and today I'm joined by Patricia Moore, Director of International Tax Services in PwC, as well as Antonios Koumbarakis, Director of Sustainability and Strategic Regulatory. We had, during these last days, very interesting presentation on technological development, many aspects, electricity, ammonia, hydrogen, etc. It is very good to see that we are on a good way to find some solutions, but it seems that clearly we have a problem of financing. We need more finance in order to move ahead and to reach the IMO objective. I do not need to remind you this famous IMO objective, but as it was slightly mentioned by Simon Bennett, I think, during the session this afternoon, in order to reach this objective, we would need to deliver thousands, plural, of zero-carbon ships by 2030. It is highly ambitious, but not impossible. But nevertheless, in order to reach this objective, we clearly need to have a huge effort in R&D in order to be able to use all these technologies, low-carbon technologies or zero-carbon technologies. ICS commissioned Ricardo in order to estimate the different projects we would need and the amount of investment that would be needed. According to Ricardo, 120 challenges has been identified, representing 265 projects for which we would need $4.4 billion in financing. This is absolutely huge, and to finance these projects, we identified mainly three sources. Public financing. I immediately say that during this public finance presentation, we will not describe some tax incentives, such as R&D tax credit, etc., but we will focus on non-tax incentives and public subsidies. Private financing, banks, investors, etc., and we will see how they are managing, and we all manage Poseidon and other taxonomy rules that are very important and currently under discussions. And at last, sectorial financing. We already had some elements during the previous session on IMRB, IMRF, and also levy-based MBM. We will come back on this. So first, public financing. Before leaving the floor to Patricia, I would like to show you this chart published by the World Bank in 2019, based on 17 and 18 figures. So of course, the shipping is not included in this analysis, because in 17 and 18, we did not discuss about ETS, carbon tax, etc. for the shipping sector. What you can see is that carbon revenues, including carbon tax and cap and trade mechanisms such as ETS, are allocated at only 42% to environmental projects. And 38% of these revenues are allocated to the general budgets of the states. You have some, let's say, good children, such as Japan. Japan allocates 100% of the carbon tax to environmental projects. while you have other countries such as Sweden that allocate 0% to climate projects of their carbon tax revenues, but 100% is allocated to the general budget of the state. I cannot forget an announcement made last week, on Friday, I think, by DFDS, according which DFDS very promising hydrogen ferry has been put on hold, and we had a very small presentation on Monday, because of the EU funding that has been rejected. So I have one question for you, Patricia. Could carbon tax and cap and trade mechanism be efficient to finance R&D?
The answer will be yes. And using carbon pricing is recognized as the most efficient way to cut and reduce the emission and to encouraging the shift toward a greener energy. But in addition to that, and to tackle the energy transition, governments are collecting more and more revenue from carbon pricing mechanism. The carbon pricing mechanism usually takes two forms. One is carbon taxes, and the other is the various emission trading system or carbon border adjustment mechanism. We have now more than 57 different countries who have a carbon pricing mechanism and who are using it to finance and support transition, but who are scheduling implementation of such mechanism. What we can say is that for industry like shipping, where they are operating globally, is a lack of harmonization between the various systems, which create a difficulty. However, the increasing resource of carbon pricing allow government to support and to finance energy transition projects according to specific funding opportunities. What they are doing, and there is an increasing number of climate investment prior to the COVID crisis, and which the public funding contribute to by increasing the amount of public funding to climate investment by 60% since 2011. But the issue is mainly to navigate among the various offerings which are existing regarding subsidy and public financing. There is a huge and significant set of measures which has been implemented with different scope. And the difficulty, and the main difficulty, is for companies to navigate among these opportunities to determine whether they are eligible to it. For the FDS, for instance, and if they pass the first round of the public funding because their hydrogen project was recognized as a good one and meeting the energy transition objective, however, they do not pass the second one because of the lack of scaling they were saying that there is against this project. So the difficulty, and the main difficulty to get this public funding, is first to identify the projects which are eligible to this funding, then to assess clearly what are the eligibility conditions and scrutinize them in order to make sure that the presentation of the project fit the funding scheme, and afterward to monitor. And in addition, on a regular basis, we have new opportunity and funding opportunity which are created, and therefore for businesses, the issue is to monitor and to keep track on what is going on in order not to miss any funding opportunity. But despite the amount and the increasing amount of public funding in respect of climate investments, the public investment will not be sufficient due to the amount of the investment needed in order to achieve the net zero position. And therefore, they need to be supplemented by private funding. Governments are usually saying that if they...
We seem to have an issue with your microphone. Can you just talk into this and please carry on? Apologies. Your microphone is fine. Just
This one?
Perfect.
Sorry. No, and the government are usually thinking that if they contribute to publicly finance the energy transition, they will also create a need and a support from the private sector in order to finance this transition.
Thank you very much, Patricia. So, completing your remark, now the transition is immediately to Antonio's and the private financing. Before leaving the floor to Antonio's, you may have read this article in Shipping Watch last week, where drilling companies say that bank loans are becoming a headache for them. It is a concern. And more interestingly, because of course we are discussing about environment, it is written that one of the reasons of this reluctance by banks are the requirement that companies must have a stable sustainability agenda is being more strictly enforced. So Antonios, could investors, banks, etc., show some reluctance to finance R&D in the shipping sector?
Thank you very much. I hope I can also speak without the microphone. The question is basically not an easy one, but what we see currently in the market is that investors in general, asset managers and banks play an important role in the transition. And here, private financing in particularly play an important role, also several commitments. We heard today at the beginning a lot of regulations that are coming. In 2018, the European Union has set up this high-level expert group. Now, they decided not to regulate the real economy. They decided to regulate at the first stage the financial service sector. Meaning that at the end of the day, what they created, and we heard that in one of the beginning presentations, the EU taxonomy, but also new obligations that comes in. And several financial market players on top of that decided also to be a signatory of the Poseidon Principles. And this has a huge impact at the end for the whole shipping industry, because due to this commitment, the financial institutions take into account how their climate targets, in particularly to their shipping portfolios, are aligned. And they will disclose this information year by year, because also banks request the kind of funding from their clients or institutional investors, and they take a look on this topic also. Moreover to that, we heard also a lot about the topic of net zero. At the end, what is net zero? And to understand that in the overall context is decarbonizing the balance sheet. Means the same for banks and also other companies going forward. And not only on carbon, this is the starting point, also the big six to think about that. But first of all, the question arises now due to this green tsunami that's starting from the financial service industry, this obligation will be passed to the shipping industry. And how this will be passed in particularly, there are two areas going forward. We have on the left-hand side on this slide the so-called green and social loans going forward. These are loan instruments in particularly that are available exclusively to full or partially financing or refinancing new green and social shipping projects. In particularly, there are also clear best practices as the commitment of the Poseidon, climate bond initiatives, and so on. This is only one side of the medal, and there are also dedicated KPIs we're going forward banking looking for. Also kind of ships cannot primarily dedicated to transporting fossil fuels, commitments kind of a net zero, and managing plans have to be disclosed going forward. Means the requirement will be higher. Then on the right-hand side, we have this topic of sustainability-linked loans. What is the difference here between the two? On the right-hand side, these are on dedicated targets, kind of KPIs that they selected, so-called SPT, Sustainable Performance Targets. Means going forward in the whole loan process, banks and also institutions will ask for additional information. This going much, much more further, kind of net zero, rep risk aspects and so on, and this obligation have to fulfill the shipping industry itself. If they do not do that, then there is a problem. And here also, this is a said why financial institutions doing that. Decarbonizing of the balance sheet means on the asset side, decarbonizing their loan books. And then on the liability side, there are other aspects such as green bonds and social bonds that coming up that play an important role. With this insight, I hope I could give you kind of a feeling what's this topic of the headache that we heard here at the beginning plays an important role. It's here for the FS spaces to have this risk under control, but now this headache will be enormously because they pass this obligation to the shipping industry, and to know exactly what is coming, it's very important. With this, I would like to hand over to you, Bet.
Thank you very much, Antonios. So now, since we noticed that we probably have some issues in terms of public financing, private financing, now let's envisage a sectorial financing, meaning financing granted by the industry itself. As a prerequisite, we must not forget that technologies necessary to achieve IMO objectives do not yet exist in a form or a scale which is commercially viable for widespread use by international shipping. This means that investment must be made in technologies, in fuels, in propulsion system, and in infrastructure, as it has been extensively described during these 2 days. The point is also that the responsibility and the control of all these investments are partially on the ship owner, but are mainly on other stakeholders. Nevertheless, we need to work all together in order to manage this problem of this climate change issue. So one first initiative that has been supported and presented by ICS together with BIMCO, CLIA, and other shipping associations is the famous IMRB, IMRF initiative currently under discussion in IMO. The objective is to accelerate the development of low carbon or zero carbon fuels for the use of commercial maritime sector. And in this regard, it is proposed to establish an International Maritime Research and Development Board, together with an International Maritime Research and Development Fund, as you could read in MEPC 7574. This fund will receive revenues based on R&D contribution per ton of fuel purchased for consumption. For the time being, it is considered that $2 per ton of fuel is sufficient because the revenues of this fund would be equal to around $5 billion. That is sufficient to cover the $4.4 billion I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. In order to go quickly and to act as soon as possible, because there is an urgency, this fund could be implemented through an amendment to MARPOL Annex 6 and would be valid for 10 to 15 years. Of course, this fund would be under the supervision of IMO, so as you can see, the fund being managed by the board under the supervision of IMO and of course reporting to MEPC. What is the state of the discussions? We can only regret that discussions within MEPC go to nowhere, and we do hope that MEPC 77 will at last end the discussion. This initiative has been co-sponsored by the major maritime countries such as Denmark, Japan, Singapore, Liberia, and Switzerland, because we forget too often that Switzerland is the 4th maritime country in Europe and the 9th in the world. And some concerns have been addressed, especially during MEPC 76, it has been confirmed that a portion of the fund collected through this IMRF would be allocated to small island developing states and less developing countries. And in terms of impact assessment, that is absolutely crucial. The $2 of R&D contribution per ton of fuels is considered as having a very limited impact on the bunker cost, on the freight rate. And of course, in the current circumstances, this is absolutely crucial. So it means that we would probably have no increase of the price of goods and products carried by sea for the final consumers. And last but not least, we would have no adverse impact on socio-economic progress and development. There is a last, and Simon Bennett discussed this 1 hour ago, the levy-based MBM. There is a proposal that is put on the table by SES, and there is another proposal put by Marshall Island and Solomon Island, with a mandatory high ambition levy, because in this case it would not be $2 per ton of fuel purchase, but $250 or even $300 per ton of CO2e. That is absolutely huge. But I do not want to discuss the problem of the revenues. It has been discussed during the first panel. I just would like to draw your attention on the allocation of the revenues of this fund based on Marshall Island and Solomon Island proposal. 51% would be allocated to the climate change adaptation mitigation, and only 33% to R&D, and 16% on admin cost. I'm afraid, it is my personal opinion, I'm afraid that in fact the priority has not been understood. The priority is the climate change. We need to fight the cause of the climate change, not the consequence. So it means that personally I do not understand why we have 51% in order to manage the consequence of the climate change and only 33% in order to manage the cause of the climate change. Probably it should be at least the reverse. The other point is this proposal of Marshall Island is inspired by Trafigura proposal that has been published last year. And Trafigura proposal was based on the low carbon fuel subsidies, meaning that in order to fill the gap between sustainable fuels and fossil fuels, it was proposed to subsidize through a purchase subsidies, the purchase of low carbon fuel. I will come back on the problem of the purchase subsidy that also raised some issues in terms of economic impact. Otherwise, in terms of governance, this project is very similar as the IMRF-IMRB proposal. It is based on a dual structure with a fund, International Greenhouse Gas Levy Fund, and a board, and also both are, of course, under the supervision of IMO. So there is no problem in terms of transparency, etc. And the implementation way is exactly the same as IMRF-IMRB through an amendment to MARPOL Annex 6. To conclude on the three sources of fundings, I think we should not forget one point. The best pollution is the pollution we do not produce. So it is absolutely crucial that we must focus and we must put all means available on R&D. We had, once again, we had some presentations that are very encouraging, etc. We are probably on a good way. We must not stop this effort. We also need to have a pragmatic approach. And I remember one of the sentences pronounced by Michel Desjoyaux on Monday. He claimed a pragmatic approach. And he's fully right. And we must have this pragmatic approach on all steps of the supply chain. No need to have sustainable fuel if we cannot use sustainable fuel on board of ships or if these sustainable fuels are not available everywhere in the world. So we must have a very pragmatic approach, and once again, we must have a global vision of this issue. Last point regarding the purchase subsidies. There may be also an impact because the purchase subsidies are considered as allowing a shift to another product. Yes, but if the other product does not exist, or if the other product is not available in sufficient quantity, I do not know exactly what we would subsidize. And the other point is that in the price impact of purchase subsidies is still unclear, and other experience of purchase subsidies in environmental sector, by the way, prove that in fact the price of the good for which you receive a purchase subsidy increased. So this is the end of the presentation. You may have some questions, and I will give you time to write your question on the app. And waiting this, I just would like to add one question to Patricia and Antonio's. Patricia, you mentioned that there is no harmonization of carbon tax. Some countries are putting in place some carbon tax, or they are not. The levels are different, etc.
They vary from 1 to 100.
Yeah. ETS has been considered by ICS as potentially a source of a trade war. Antonios, you mentioned Poseidon and taxonomy, etc. Taxonomy is an EU project. Don't you think that focusing on the environmental aspects, we may not forget another problem that we may create some geopolitical risks, in fact? Couldn't we have some fight between countries based on this different sourcing and this different finance?
It already started because, as I was saying, is regarding the main issue is regarding regional approach of carbon pricing. You are facing a situation where there is conflict. For instance, China already protests against the carbon border adjustment mechanism, saying that it's not compliant with the World Trade Organization. And this situation can shift industry from one country to another and create difficulties. And there is also, this morning, there was also discussion against, between the US and China regarding the trade and so on. So definitely by increasing the price of product or services, it could create difficulties, sure. And the last thing is that recently, during the G20 summit, they are trying to claim for a global carbon pricing, but it's not active yet, and it's not a given based on the current situation.
Moreover, to elaborate on the aspect, this is a kind of a problem that we have always when we have kind of legislation, regulation, regulatory arbitrage at the end of the day. And also the risk from sustainability risk that will be calculated as physical, transitional and litigation that spillovers to other jurisdictions at the end of the day for the shipping industry, then to have a security risk in Africa, for example, when you build then up there a fleet, kind of these spillover effect, it can be seen. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, and this is what currently we see, is that there has been also a lot of discussion regarding data and ESG data itself. And currently what we see in the market is that every shipping company will be rated, nevertheless, by Sustainalytics or MSCI to such extent with their ESG rating. And what we see is now currently European law and legislation means concretely the EU taxonomy flows in the rating methodology within. That anyhow, where you are globally placed, if in Japan, in Hong Kong, Panama or itself, this will play an important role. Means is kind of potentially the taxonomy can play here an important role and be an international standard. We will see that there are also discussions on exterritoriality, and even Switzerland is currently working very extensive on this common language. But there are kind of problems that we're facing, and this has to be tackled in a very pragmatic way at the end of the day.
Thank you. We have one first question probably for you, Antonios. How are finance providers dealing with stranded asset risk today? Is this being factored into lending decisions?
For the financial institution, generally, you have to ask them, do you have a sustainability risk definition? Some front runners have that, means the bigger banks, yes, others no. If they don't have that, then they don't have a methodology in particularly to assess and deal with this risk. Methodology is one of them, beside of 30 methodologies in the market, is to evaluate the stranded assets. Of course, some have exclusion policy at the end of the day. Yes, this is fine. But they have the risk, and this is a very important risk in their books. This is also mentioned internationally to avoid these risks. And that's the reason why they have this exclusion policy in place now, planning to assessing that properly and to evaluate that so that there is going forward no stranded asset risk, but today there is a huge risk. Is this being factored into the lending decisions? Not yet. Going forward, yes.
Clear.
Olivia, we do have a question from the audience, if you'd like to take that now.
Can you hear me? Well, it's more of a comment which connects to the session that we had on regulations and the comments from the panelists now. Looking at the EU ETS through the lens of taxation or subsidy, however you coin that, my experience has been being in a dialogue with various ship owners for the last year until July 14th. That dialogue was more of a, I don't know, greenwashing. People have not been really mobilized, and it was quite interesting that the EU ETS was introduced on July 14th, which coincides with Bastille Day. And my experience has been that the dialogue has changed quite dramatically and in fact helped me mobilize private equity. So in a sense, on the one hand, you have those legislations providing a specific framework which at last creates a specific way to quantify that investment. And so I think the level of interest is quite different, starkly different from what it has been until that legislation kicked in.
It's a question or comment?
More a comment, yeah.
I think it started off as a comment, and it was certainly pronounced as a comment to start with. But do you have anything to say on that, or?
Probably it generally means, as we heard a lot also with the emission trading scheme and so on. Keep in mind, net zero is about the big six. And the big six means there are concrete for net zero going forward to mitigate that. There are 6 strategies: substitution, compensation, and neutralization. And one aspect, of course, in the compensation aspect is the emission trading scheme that plays an important role also going forward. But nevertheless, as I said, there are other aspects such as R&D that we highlight also that should be prioritized to such extent, not only to compensate. Also pooling of fleets and so on, there are other topics here.
Do we have any other questions? We have one over to the side there, with the microphone coming very quickly.
Thank you, Ulf Kanne speaking. We have seen before that Marshall Islands suggests to spend 50% on climate mitigation, and you said that would be far too much because the money should go to R&D. But isn't that a misunderstanding? Because climate mitigation is defined as action to limit climate change and its effects. So that means actually this would be funding not developing new technologies, but applying existing technologies in order to reduce climate change.
It is a clear point that should be clarified by Marshall Islands and Cameron Islands. Personally, I'm not sure reading MEPC papers, but you may have another opinion. And this
it's a definition of climate mitigation. What, as far as I know.
Sorry?
The definition of climate mitigation is that this is about limiting climate change and its effects.
For me, it's limiting the effect.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
I saw, and then...
Yes, thank you. You said about R&D, indeed, it's a key to the decarbonization. How about the horizon? Well, it's not anymore 2020, but it's 2024 now, from the European Fund Innovation that can finance, and from which, of course, Switzerland is not anymore part of from recently. How do you see the contribution to the R&D from the European funds? can maybe the funds of the MIO contribute to the European funds also, and also to the Swiss fund for R&D?
I think that there is various initiatives and programs which are dedicated to sea, ocean transportation, which exist at the level of the European Union. So, as I said, the issue is to determine whether, and the FDS is a good example, is to determine how your R&D project can fit the financing scheme. How do you meet the criterion? But there is some funding which exists at the level of the European Union.
Moreover to that, the funding in the European Union will be aligned with the EU taxonomy. Here in particularly at the current, there are 6. We spoke about the environmental taxonomy, not the S and the G that is upcoming. In the EU, when you take a look, there are 6 objectives: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation at the current stage. These will be prioritized. Afterwards, you will have maritime, you will have also circular economy, that means recycling of the ships. This will play an important role going forward. Then you have biodiversity and so on. Based on that, we will see the flows will be prioritized to such extent.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions at all? Last question for you, Olivier. This obviously seems to... Oh, actually, I think we've got one that's just come up on the screen while we were talking. Is this something from Nicholas? In fact, we have 2 questions.
Will the MRB and... No, the first question has been answered. Will the IMB and EU ETS be active concurrently? Probably.
Not sure.
Not sure, but...
No, there is a lot of pushback currently at the discussion regarding the Fit for 55 package, and a huge fear of government and politicians of new yellow jacket movement. So, and there is currently ongoing discussion, and it's far from being sure that an implementation will come shortly. And particularly, I do not believe that there will be an implementation in 2023.
Would you have a question that's come up quickly, Olivier? And then we'll have to, unfortunately, bring it to an end after this question. Do you want to touch on this? Okay, that's just a comment. Otherwise, I mean, last to bring it to a close, I mean, this is obviously something that you feel strongly about. Would you say the current situation makes you a bit angry?
Yes, I am very angry, honestly. I would like first to thank Mr. Schopfer and his team, because this conference it was a fantastic opportunity to present some beautiful technological developments, etc. And this helped us to answer to some people saying that we do not know why you are discussing this, because in fact you have everything in hand. That's wrong. Or other people saying, but in fact you do nothing in order to reduce your carbon footprint. It is wrong, and this conference clearly demonstrates that this is wrong. We, at the level of the industry, we are very active. We, small companies, big companies, it was very interesting to have this type of presentation these days. Now it is to the state to act. And COP26 and MEPC 77 will be absolutely crucial. If states are still discussing of different things, etc., and if they do not take strong decision in order to finance R&D, we will clearly miss the objective of 2030 and 2050 defined by IMO, or even defined by the EU, because they are more restrictive. And clearly we should not forget, once again, the first objective. The first objective is to fight climate change. It is not to fight consequence of the climate change. And you know, I cannot forget one sentence of former president, French President Jacques Chirac. In 2002, in South Africa, during the climate summit, he said, "Our house is burning and we are looking away." Unfortunately, my feeling is that 20 years after, our house is still burning and we are still looking away. And I'm afraid that with these discussions or this wrong target, this non-ending discussion and these wrong targets, we could complete this sentence by saying, our house is burning, and we are looking away, and instead of calling firemen to extinguish the fire, we are calling the insurance company. And personally, I cannot accept this. Once again, we do need act now, and it's a call to the states to not to lose the opportunity of COP26 and MEPC 77.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. On that note, unfortunately, we have to bring this panel discussion to an end. I think it's been very, very interesting and very, very enlightening. So first of all, thank you, Olivier. Very, very interesting. Patricia and also Antonius, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking them. And Patricia, I'd also like to apologize for the microphone issues. So that does bring us to the end of the day, and I'll just take a couple of minutes of your time. I think it's worth just having a very quick recap. We've covered an awful lot over the last 2 days. And so yesterday we were looking at the future fuels and propulsion systems, all the different options. There are a lot of different opportunities, but there are also a lot of choices to be made, and it's very difficult to know which of the choices is going to be the right choice. We also finished off yesterday with a very interesting discussion between MSC and Shell discussing their collaboration they have at the moment, and I think that's very, very important for this industry. We all need to be working together and finding opportunities to collaborate and not everybody working in their own corner. Today, we started off the discussion with Andre from MSC talking about digitization within the container industry, which I think, again, is very, very important. There was a figure not too long ago that 20% of costs of moving containers around the world were due to paper. So this is something that needs to be changed and is changing very quickly. We were talking about technologies. We then moved on to talk about compliance and regulations. Very, very interesting discussion. Then we had a very good presentation on the COVID situation and how there are efforts being taken to help the crew on board the vessel, and then finishing up with funding. And throughout all of this, we realized there are a lot of choices to be made, but also there's a lot of available data. We need to collect that data. We need to be able to manage that data. We also need to collaborate. It's very important. And this is not a choice. This is not something we say, oh, I don't want to. It doesn't really matter whether we want to or not. It's a question of saying, how are we going to get out the other side of it? That's the only thing that we really need to put our heads together and figure out. We certainly have the tools. The tools are either present or we are able to produce those tools. So there's no doubt that we will get there. It's just a question of how we'll get there and whether we make a mess of it along the way or whether we do something that we can be proud of and be proud to our children. We've had excellent presentations. One thing I would mention is that the presentations would normally be shared with all of the attendees after the event. If you have given a presentation and you would rather your presentation is not shared, then please do get in touch with the organizers of the conference. And on that note, I would like to say a huge thank you to Bernard, Maxcom, his team, Ina. They've all done a very, very, very good job. To all of the tech staff as well, who've kept this thing running very, very well. Please, can you join me in giving them a round of applause? So on that note, that brings my participation to an end. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and for your enthusiasm. It's been a pleasure, and I'm going to pass over to Bernard. I think he has a couple of words to say to you before we close up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'll be very brief. You've said almost everything I had to say. Well, it's been a fascinating 2 days, and I'd like to thank all the speakers and have a big round of applause for all the speakers of this conference as well, because they made it so interesting. Thank you. And of course, the event has been made possible thanks to all our partners. You can see them here. I'm not going to list them, but some of them, including MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Company, have already confirmed their renewal of the partnership for next year. So we look forward to that, and I'm very grateful to them and to all our partners. We're also very open to your feedback. We're not expert. Ina has done a fantastic job in building up most of the content of this conference. But we're not expert from the shipping industry, so we rely on your feedback, on your expertise. So feel free to send us an email. We'll also send a survey to you, so you can give us your feedback about the conference, what you liked or didn't like, and suggest speakers or story angles for next year. A big thank you to finish, like Richard said, to all our technical team from Mazalink. It's been very smooth. Thank you. Fantastic job. And a big thank you to Ina. I think deserves a big applause for all the work. And Marine, Alex, and Alexia from my team at Maxcom. Thank you very much. Also our photographer who's just left, and our videographer, Christophe. All the photos will be available on a photo database that we have. It's maxcom-media.com. You'll get all that in writing in a newsletter in the coming days, but if you want to have access to those images from the conference, they're available. And the video will be also on the website and newsletter. We've enjoyed organizing this event very much, and I hope you have as well. And so we say thank you, and see you next year. Thank you.